I went to my local library to see if they had a copy of this author available, and he's not the most famous one out there, so the librarians had to look him up for me. And they were like, well, yes, we have a copy, but it's just been checked out. And it felt like a rom-com plot. Out of all of the books, out of all of the authors, we both decided to check this one out. But life is not a rom-com, and I simply got a call from the library a little while later saying that they checked it back in. With that pointless anecdote out of the way, let's finally talk about Sigizmund Krzhizhanovsky. That name is gonna kill me today. I need to preface this video by saying that Sigizmund Krzhizhanovsky is a very niche author, if not totally unknown. I've never heard of him, my local librarians have never heard of him, and based on the amount of information available online, not many people have. I only learned of him because Columbia University Press published his story in a series of stories by Russian authors that they've done, but also New York Review Books published a lot of Krzhizhanovsky in the 2010s, so I got curious. A critic and researcher that discovered and popularized Krzhizhanovsky as much as he could called him an overlooked genius, and I think that's partially true. He could be considered genius in some sense, but he was also overlooked for a reason. Let's talk about it. There's not a lot that we know about Krzhizhanovsky himself, and even less of that is kind of relevant for this conversation that we're having today. He was born 11th of February 1887 in Kiev in a Polish family. He received a pretty good education for the time period. He attended the Kiev Gymnasium and later Kiev University, majoring in law with a minor in history and philology. During his university years and a little bit later, he had a chance to travel Europe, broadening his horizons, so to speak. He also spoke a lot of the languages. Russian wasn't even his native one, so he had a chance to read a lot of books and generally consume information in these languages as well. By all accounts, he was very intelligent, very smart, with a keen eye and interest for many subjects. And by the looks of it, he also had somewhat of an eidetic memory, just based on how quickly and easily he retained information. And so he returned to Kiev with a wealth of knowledge. He abandoned his practice as a lawyer with the fall of the Russian Empire. I'm getting conflicting information as to whether or not he served in the Civil War, but by the end of it, 1922, he and his wife, actress Anna Bovshek, relocated to Moscow. By that time, Krzhizhanovsky fully dedicated his efforts to literary pursuits and becoming a writer. One of his stories was even published in Kiev 1919, but literary success never actually came. In a few years in Moscow, he established himself in the literary circles. He was friendly with people like Mikhail Bulgakov or theater director Meir Holt. He and his wife hosted literary soirees where he read his short stories, and they were quite a success in those rooms, but they were never published. The early Soviet Union wanted something entirely different from its authors. Krzhizhanovsky is probably one of the few authors that were denied publication by the censors, not necessarily because of their anti-Soviet ideas, but rather it feels like they simply didn't understand him. Yes, some of his stories were critical of the revolution and the newly established Soviet Union, but that was not it. Maxim Gorky, the daddy of the Soviet literature, accused Krzhizhanovsky of idleness of thoughts and words. He believed that such philosophical ideas might meddle in the minds of our youth. In essence, Krzhizhanovsky was too abstract, too philosophical, too much, while the USSR needed concise messaging and clear ideas. Most of his writing happened in the 1920s, 1930s. In 1939, Krzhizhanovsky was even accepted into the Union of Soviet Writers, a great accomplishment for any writer in the Soviet Union, but that didn't actually move the needle in terms of publishing. So Krzhizhanovsky simply took everything that he's written, compiled it, structured it, and left it for the better day. There is almost nothing written by him after the 1940s in terms of fiction. He wrote a lot of non-fiction from that point on. For example, a lot of scientific papers on Pushkin and Bernard Shaw, for example. He also dabbled in plays and screenplays, and some of them were even produced, but they were not that successful either. He passed away in 1950 here in Moscow, beloved by small literary circles and the Soviet intelligentsia, but completely unknown by the public. His literary legacy was preserved by his widow, Anna, who kept the manuscripts, that in the 1980s fell into the lap of a critic, Mutter, who saw the overlooked genius and started shopping these stories around, and so they started getting published in the 1980s. We now have a 6-volume collection of all of the works by Krzhizhanovsky. English translations started appearing in the early 2000s, almost all of them done by Joanne Turnbull. All of Krzhizhanovsky fiction is short stories. He has some novellas, but almost all of them as well consist of like a collection of small short stories united by something. Here I have 2 books. Here, this one is a collection titled by the author, The Fairy Tales for Wunderkinder. And this one here is Postmark Moscow. I've looked up which stories have been translated into English and mostly focused on those in my reading experience, although I have not read all of them, and we will get to why in a second. Since it is all short fiction, let's talk broadly about Krzhizhanovsky's body of work, and I will bring up relevant examples as we go. So, what is Krzhizhanovsky's fiction like? The author himself called it experimental realism. They've since been called story metaphor, story symbol, or like intertextual parable. In the broadest of terms, it is phantasmagorical, grotesque, satire, parable, all sprinkled with a heavy dose of philosophy, intertextuality, and postmodernism. To give you an idea, the story The Runaway Fingers is about a pianist and his right hand that runs away from him. The Unbitten Elbow, where a man makes it his mission to bite his own elbow and how that almost crashes the world economy. The Life and Opinions of a Thought, it is about a thought, how it is born inside the mind of the thinker, then is recorded on paper and travels from one book to another through citations until it is finally reunited with its thinker as an epitaph on his grave. Even his more grounded pieces, like Autobiography of a Corpse or The Gamblers, still retain a lot of the elements of satire and grotesque in them. Now, it needs to be said that I am a fan of satire, but not of phantasmagorical and grotesque. These last two tend to obfuscate the meaning that was allegorical to begin with, and my mind doesn't like that. I am absolutely terrible at finding hidden meanings, especially if I'm intentionally being misdirected from them. It's especially noticeable when I watch movies. If the movie is trying to misdirect me from like a hidden meaning or plot twist, I fall for it every single time. So phantasmagoria just simply makes me mad. Like, what do you mean? Krzhizhanovsky has a story that drove me up the wall. It is called The Old Man in the Sea, which is obviously a reimagining of Hemingway. And so the story goes that there is this old man who lives by the sea, and he makes his living by making question marks. One day he hears a sound that comes from his heart, and so he tears a hole in his chest and fishes a worm out. The worm needs feeding, and he can only be fed on the flesh, and so the man starts feeding him the flesh from his initial wound. And so they live happily, the old man and the worm, until one day a huge order comes in for the man to make the biggest question mark that he's ever done, and so he loses track of time and forgets to feed the worm, and the worm dies. The man is so distraught that he takes this question mark that he's made on the worm, he puts the worm on the question mark and throws the hook into the ocean, and the fish is caught on that question mark / hook, and they struggle until the line between them breaks and the fish swims away, and the man jumps in after it into the sea and never seen again. So as you can see, Krzhizhanovsky works with the text in a very complex way. There are always layers. Like, there is a theme that he's working with, normally something really grand, like space, time, or faith. Then he almost always is making some reference to a different text, like intertextuality-wise. He's in constant conversation with a different text. Then there is always a philosophical argument that he's making, or he's commenting on some sort of historical event, and then all of this is wrapped up in beautiful but complex prose. So if you figured one of these things out, it's not enough. You need all four to make sense of him. And honestly, that's mostly where the point of delineation was for me personally, which stories I liked and which ones I didn't. I know full well that the stories that I didn't like, I simply didn't get. And that's fine. If I don't know something, it's simply an opportunity for me to learn something new. It's just unfortunate that Krzhizhanovsky is not well studied, since I really needed that help. Just to give you an example, Krzhizhanovsky has a story called Orpheus in Hell, which I don't think is translated, but it is a variation on the Greek myth. So Orpheus goes down to the land of the dead and is greeted by Cerberus and plays some music for Cerberus to let him in. And Cerberus's heads start arguing amongst themselves if the music was good enough. And it gets so heated between them that they tear each other's throats out, and the beast dies and Orpheus gets free. And I was listening to a lecture where the dude was like, well, it's obviously a critique of censors and literary critics who decide what art is good enough. And I was like, yeah, obviously. Yeah, I got that. I didn't get it. In hindsight, it's probably what it is, but I didn't get it myself. But on the flip side, I loved something like The Yellow Coal, where Krzhizhanovsky envisions a world where people learned how to turn negative human emotions into energy, this new yellow coal, and how that world fell apart. I think I got most of that story right. And thus my feeling is that you need to be a very well-educated person to get Krzhizhanovsky. Krzhizhanovsky himself was very intelligent, well-read, academically knowledgeable and smart, so I feel like you need to be on the same level with him. Otherwise, you're simply not going to get the full experience. So let's look at these layers. Let's start with intertextuality. The main authors that Krzhizhanovsky pulls from, or is in this postmodern conversation with, are notably Greek mythology, all of it, Shakespeare, in a very academic sense, Edgar Allan Poe, obviously, Jonathan Swift, strong influence from Gulliver's Travels, like across the board, Hoffman, or in general, like fairy tale storylines, Brothers Grimm, Charles Perrault, doesn't matter, and Raspe, Baron Münchhausen specifically. Actually, you might be better positioned to understand Krzhizhanovsky because most of his influences are European. There's precious little that he pulls from Russian literature because there is nothing for him to pull from. Gogol's grotesque is quite different in form and intention, and the closest peer to Krzhizhanovsky is probably his contemporary Alexander Green. All of the characters have European names, settings are also vaguely European. He might just be the most European author of the Soviet Union. But coming back to intertextuality, he works with these influences in different ways as well. There is something like Death of an Elf, which doesn't rhyme in Russian, so I do not think that it was intentional, but it is obviously a reimagining of the story The Elves and the Shoemaker and its various variations. Return of Münchhausen simply takes the adventurous baron and puts him in Soviet Russia. Stravaging Strange takes the basic premise of Gulliver's Travels and just simply does its own thing with it, where the Letters Killers Club has a huge section in it that is just the postmodern riff on Shakespeare's Hamlet. There is a high chance that you know the story of the elves, so you should be able to read The Death of an Elf without any issue. For Return of Münchhausen, you simply need to know the baron in question, but for that Shakespeare thing to work, you need to have studied Shakespeare in an academic setting. Simply having read Hamlet is not enough. It's also worth mentioning that this intertextuality works within Krzhizhanovsky's own works. Themes, ideas, characters, they travel from one story to the other. Like this motif of Gulliver's Travels and people becoming either really small or really big, in something like Slightly Slightly's or Fly Elephant, for example. Also, there are almost like interconnected stories, something like The Bookmark and Someone Else's Theme are almost mirror-like reflections of one another. Reading a lot of Krzhizhanovsky helps to see this big tapestry that he's weaving and maybe helps you understand his themes a little bit better too. But let's say that you've read all of these literary influences and can navigate this plane without any issue. How's your philosophy? Ancient philosophy, obviously, but also, importantly, the teachings of Immanuel Kant, Leibniz, Schopenhauer, and all of these New Age thinkers. I'm not into philosophy, I haven't read books by these authors, and my general knowledge of the subject is rather minimal. So this entire layer that creeps up in about half of these stories, if not more, is entirely lost on me. And it is kind of important. One of the few stories that Krzhizhanovsky managed to publish during his lifetime, the very first one, Jacobi and Jacobi, is a conversation between the philosopher Friedrich Jacobi and the word as if, якобы in Russian, and it is so deeply philosophical that I gave up midway through, I'm sorry. Krzhizhanovsky mentions Kant by name on multiple occasions, and he brings up these various philosophical ideas and theses, so you could really benefit from knowing them. I'll tell you, I fully lost it in The Bridge Over the Styx, where one of the frogs that lives in the Styx River, which in itself is a reference to the frogs by Aristophanes, started discussing the ideas of transcendence with the main character. I was out. And then, something that I'm much more in tune with is the historical context of the early Soviet Union. It could be of use too, because Krzhizhanovsky works through the experience of living through World War I, the Russian Revolution, the Russian Civil War, and what the newly established Soviet Union actually was. And here too, it can work differently, like in something like Autobiography of a Corpse or The Gamblers, especially something like The Gamblers. It is kind of on the nose, but I feel like that's why it's so effective, how he doesn't shy away from the true horrors of those wars. Or it can be more allegorical, like The Yellow Coal. And the scale and magnitude of absurdity can also vary too. Like, for example, in something like The Branch Line, he hides the meaning in layers upon layers of allegory, but it is still kind of clear. There, the main character falls asleep and sees how the nightmares are planning to take over the world, and obviously the nightmares stand in for the Soviets. But then, in something like The Bookmark, there is a story of the Eiffel Tower coming alive, and seduced by the call of the communist revolution, the Eiffel Tower starts marching east, destroying everything in its wake. There is also Stravaging Strange, a very, strange story, where the main character turns the size of a fleck of dust and has some adventures that way. But one of the last adventures that he has is that he suspects his love interest of cheating on him, and he tracks down the man that she's cheating with, and he is the size of a fleck of dust at that point, and so he goes inside of the man and rallies the blood cells in him to clog an artery, thus killing that man. And that entire blood cells thing, first the protagonist is using them as a means to an end, but then he grows fond of them, and they're dying by the millions trying to clog that artery, and so he feels remorseful over it, but it still leads to the death of the host. So you can see the metaphor for the Russian Revolution and what future awaits the revolutionaries and the rest of the citizens of that living organism that we call a country. And yes, Krzhizhanovsky is skeptical of this bright Soviet future that was promised, so some of his stories lean towards dystopias. I would consider Yellow Coal to be one of them, but one of the absolute best ones is hidden inside the Letters Killers Club. In it, humans invented something that allowed them to turn the mentally ill people into zombie-like creatures that could work really well. And it was so effective that they started using it on the general populace until only a small group of people that remained sane. And then, as in any good dystopia, something went wrong and the question became what to do about it. Really effective dystopia. Krzhizhanovsky might have known Zametin. We was written a little bit before that, but I would actually consider Krzhizhanovsky's dystopia a little bit better, even though both of them lean a little bit too much into the technical aspects rather than the social one, although the social one is really, really good as well. It's just that in the beginning they try to bore you with the technical details a little bit too much. And then there is the smaller stuff, like my absolute favorite story, Quadraturin, where a magical substance can make rooms grow in size. And it is obviously a commentary on the state of the living situation here in Moscow, I want to say in the beginning of the 20th century, but probably to this day even. But then the story almost becomes like psychological horror as the room continues to grow in size and the protagonist is slowly consumed by the vast space and the darkness around him. Powerful stuff. And speaking of space, there are themes. Space, time, existence, memory, written word, all very easable and digestible, are they not? And honestly, had they not been hidden behind layers of grotesque and moral imperatives, I might have enjoyed them more. I love the story God is Dead, where Krzhizhanovsky envisions how a world would react to the death of its creator. Or Catastrophe, which deals with existentialism, yes, but also gives this beautiful apocalyptic feel. Or something like Collector of Cracks, which also deals with time. There are always layers upon layers upon layers. And then there are confusing bits, like for example in Stravaging Strange, when the protagonist gets stuck inside of a clock, and there are small creatures living in there that are either eating the time or depend on it, I don't know. And honestly, by the end, Krzhizhanovsky trained me so much to look for hidden meanings that I read Smoke-Colored Goblet and I was like, it cannot simply be about alcoholism. It is. Krzhizhanovsky was also a heavy drinker, so there's that. You know a weird fact? Not a single female character in all of these stories. The only one that comes to mind is the love interest from Stravaging Strange. Even then, she's more of an object than a true character. And I cannot say that it's a bad thing off the bat and call Krzhizhanovsky misogynist, but it is odd not to have at least one. Also, all of these stories never have a happy ending. It ends always either with seclusion or with the denial of the reality by the main protagonist, mostly through death. Another theme that I should bring up is the written word, letters, and alphabet. There is this constant motif of letters running away from him and being unreliable, which mostly sounds like undiagnosed dyslexia, if we're being honest, but there is likely a bigger picture here as well. The biggest indicator is the Letters Killers Club, where the overarching story is this idea that there is this group of people who formed a club, and they've decided to kind of reject books and writing stuff down in general, and so they now meet and tell each other stories that way. This idea of putting thoughts into words and onto paper and them losing meaning ties into these other philosophical ideas that Krzhizhanovsky deals with. It's just simply that I haven't read anything by him that would have given me enough clues to understand it, so I'm just simply going to point you that there is there and you can figure it out on your own if you're so inclined. But the final layer to all of this, and probably the most crucial for us to be calling Krzhizhanovsky a genius, is his language, because oh my god, what a beautiful prose. It reminded me slightly of Nabokov, who also liked to experiment with the language, or even Platonov, in a sense that Krzhizhanovsky is also not bound by the rules and structure of the Russian language. It almost is not enough for him. But in contrast to Platonov, Krzhizhanovsky is playful. It comes easy for him. It feels effortless, both to write, I would imagine, and to read, especially to read. He uses Russian language to the fullest extent, a lot of interesting choices with literary devices, a lot of synecdoches, toigmas, metaphors, symbolisms, personifications, and all of that, but also absolutely beautiful usage of alliteration. I especially noticed it in Runaway Fingers. I was listening to an audiobook of that one, and it just makes the text flow in a, like, it sounds like musical almost. Фалды фрака свисали с верхушки, а пальцы прыгнули к черному ящику рояля и мерным бегом по прямой мощенной костяным клавишам дороги. But also he experiments with the language by creating neologisms. He borrows a lot from other languages and integrates those words in, but also he simply weaves words in new but fitting ways. I will put some examples on the screen now. These are not going to be the best ones out there because I wasn't actually highlighting as I was reading, and then by the end of it, when I thought that I should do that, it was a little bit too late. And some of it is also just untranslatable wordplay. I cannot imagine how John Turnbull just translated all of it. And honestly, I rarely notice such things in authors, like I'm almost never tempted to pull quotes, but here I was reading it and I was constantly pausing thinking like, what an interesting phrase, and like, what a cool line. I think I would enjoy the process of slow reading these texts because I was still rushing a little bit to get this video out. And I think I would enjoy like sitting, reading it and highlighting the specific word choices and phrases. That sounds like a fun night in. Can you tell how introverted I am and that I have no friends? Krzhizhanovsky is often compared to authors like Kafka, or interestingly, like to something like Borges, but the truth of the matter is that he is kind of unique, especially in Russian literature. Removing my personal bias against grotesque and all of that, I really think that Krzhizhanovsky could have used the experience of actual publishing to make his stories sharper. His stories often read as if they were written with one reader in mind, and that was himself. He doesn't always provide enough clues to understanding, takes leaps of logic that you would struggle to follow, or sometimes goes too far down the allegory route that making sense of it becomes too complicated for a casual reader. The process of editing and critique received not from his intellectual peers, but like actual readers, would have helped him hone his skills. And I'm not suggesting to dumb his prose down, that's not what I'm saying, but like tying loose ends a little bit better, making parallels a little bit clearer, because some of these stories are marvelous. I wouldn't change a thing about them. They have a very clear messaging and the tools used are quite appropriate, but it's mostly the short stories. When you get to novellas, it kind of falls off the rails a little bit. I sense it especially in Stravaging Strange because I still do not understand what was the point of all of that. Individual stories and scenes are often brilliant, like for example, the scene of the protagonist being stuck inside of a thermometer. It's an interesting view of perseverance and the loss of hope. And even weirder bits, like the conversation that he has with the King of Hearts on the playing cards, they have their merits. It's just that the overarching story is so weak by comparison. And yes, it is about a journey and not a destination, but I feel like these stories are stronger if there is an overarching theme that ties it all together. And Krzhizhanovsky always leaves that bit underdeveloped, and thus the entire novella suffers for it. I feel similarly about the Letters Killers Club because the overarching narrative ties in with the dystopia that I mentioned at the end there, but it is so vague that it doesn't work as strongly as it probably should have done. At the end of the day, Krzhizhanovsky has a lot of things to say, and a very unorthodox way of saying it, so unlike anything that we've had in Russian literature, so it is kind of sad that he is so unknown, but at the same time it's probably safe to say that he's likely to remain that way because he's not going to appeal to a wider audience. And honestly, I don't know if he wanted that. Maybe he would have been happy with a small but dedicated fan base because he didn't even get that during his lifetime. But at the very least, Krzhizhanovsky deserves to be discovered, is what I'm saying. Should you read Krzhizhanovsky? I think you should give him a try, especially if you have a copy available to you at a local library or something. I think the English translations are also on Amazon, if that's worth it to you. My absolute favorite story is Quadraturin. I can definitely recommend that one. The two dystopias are really good, Yellow Coal and that section from the Letters Killers Club. God is Dead is really good, and The Gamblers is very strong and poignant. I can definitely recommend that you read Gamblers. The last line from that story is an absolute favorite of mine, and I'm not going to tell you what it is because it is a spoiler. The next level up is probably the entirety of the Letters Killers Club and something like the branch line. While if you want to see how extra Krzhizhanovsky can actually get, then it is Bridge Over the Styx or Stravaging Strange for sure. And I'm only recommending the stories that I've read. There are plenty that I haven't, mostly because I really wanted to get this video for April and I was already reaching the point of diminishing returns and getting really frustrated with Krzhizhanovsky here. But I feel like I'm gonna come back to him at a later date when I don't have a time limit and just sitting with him and slowly reading him while appreciating the language minutiae and also maybe taking another crack at understanding themes, because there is definitely a lot to explore here.